hello. Welcome to our ISAS seminar. Very much appreciate the fact that you're here on a Friday afternoon. It's very nice of you. Today we will be speaking with Dr. Alica Kizekova on relations between Central Europe and India. Now, Dr. Kizekova is the major lead for international relations and research and lecturer in security and strategic studies and international relations at Curtin University in Australia. Dr. Kizekova also used to be the head of the Asia Pacific unit in the Institute of International Relations Prague, where I had the opportunity to work with her some years ago. And also she boasts substantial government experience. She used to be an advisor to the president of the Chamber of Deputies of the Parliament of the Czech Republic, and also she used to be an advisor to the Slovak government, the government of Slovakia. She used also to be a MacArthur Visiting Associate Fellow at the Rajaratnam School at NTU. This is kind of the brief introduction. Today we will be discussing India and Central Europe relations. So just before we start, it's very important to note that Central Europe, by saying Central Europe, we usually refer to four countries, namely Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Slovakia. So these are the V4, the Visegrad Four countries. So this is kind of these are the countries that we're going to look into today. The relationship between India and those four countries goes back to the 19th century, when the field of Indology started to develop in Central Europe. One of the first, by the way, chairs in Sanskrit was in Charles University in Prague in the mid-19th century. And then in the 20th century, the relationship started to accelerate, and it reached in many ways its peak during the communist period, during the Cold War, when the countries of Central Europe were part of the Soviet sphere, and India had a special relationship with Moscow and with many of these countries. These countries developed very much their economic and political relationship with India, especially in the 70s and 80s. Now, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, obviously there was a decline in the relationship. But in the last 15 years, things have started again to gain momentum. For example, last year, Prime Minister Modi visited Poland, and he signed a strategic partnership with Poland. Also, there is a very substantial defense cooperation relationship between Warsaw and New Delhi. This year, also, President Murmu visited Slovakia. The Indian president visited Slovakia. So there is this kind of a positive momentum in the relationship. But regrettably, there has been also some substantial challenges. For example, a lot of Central Europeans were not able to fully understand the Indian position on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and there was substantial Central European criticism of India. More recently, during Operation Sindoor and the India-Pakistan conflict, I think that some people in Delhi were a little bit disappointed that Central European countries didn't take a much more decisively pro-Indian position. So with this background of kind of momentum, but also of some challenges, I want to turn to Dr. Kizekova. Please.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here in your nice institute. It was unplanned, and here we are on Friday afternoon. I really enjoy going to India because it opens my eyes to more first-hand experience. It's not second-hand from books. It's not from some discussions, but it's me going there and engaging. And I found out that in India and in general in South Asia, actually, people like discussions. It's so dynamic. You look at the television and the screen is divided into four parts and everybody's arguing points. It's very honest. And when I speak in India, and I know we're on a recording here, I'm used to being on recording, but sometimes, I forget that I should still watch my, narratives, because they can be without context taken the wrong direction. But why I'm saying this, because I've learned that people in India like when you speak from heart. They really acknowledge it, that it's honest and you don't mess around with words. And I think that's something that brings us closer with some Central European countries. There is, especially Slovakia, I'm from Slovakia, we can be very direct and say what we think. As you mentioned, historically, when I wrote the first commentary and I was asked by Delhi ORF to write a commentary, was about historical relations. And that was linked to obviously poet Tagore and influences on the Czech opera, and also obviously the movements, nonviolent movements. We were backwards in Czechoslovakia with our movement because we had the Russian invasion. So we had a different experience, and I should say Soviet troop invasion, because there was a mix of soldiers, not just Russians in that group. But that's the thing, we had that experience. So as you pointed out today, we are tapping into that historical experience with Russia, unlike India that has a different kind of sentiment towards Russia as a partner. So there is that divergence. So what we have as a convergence, obviously, is the nonviolent, the dialogue part of deal. And obviously, we come closer with all this innovation, digital manufacturing. They are all positives, but we, of course, come together on the other side as less flexible sometimes with the partners. Um, but when I look at this relationship, I look at actually what India is doing globally as a player. This is not separated from how India is trying to position itself. And I found out from my experiences that India is becoming this laboratory of ideas, especially through Raisina Dialogue, where I go every year. Sometimes I get to sit next to prominent politicians, Sashi Tharoor and these people sit next to me and have their debates about what it's like to be post, obviously, the Inglorious Empire and British, experiences with the British. So we have these debates, but obviously that shows me that India is able to bring everybody to the room and let everybody speak their perspectives without interference. Even Chinese, even saying that we have difficult relationship, but the invitation is always sent out. So it's a novelty for Europeans in general. It's a novelty for Central Europeans who have very distinct sentiments about certain nations. So I think we are learning this, and that was my first experience through this platform. Also for Jaishankar to come to Bratislava to Globsec Dialogue a few years ago and say, Europeans, you have expectations of us to respond to conflict in Ukraine. But honestly, I have different issues here. I have to take care of millions of people out of poverty, make sure they have their energy resources. And when we have our issues in our region, you tend to ignore them and don't come to our help. So he was very honest, and he said, we will not get involved in this conflict the way you would like us to get involved. And it was a slap to the European Union, who was attending this forum. And it was interestingly in Central Europe where this took place. So, I mean, Central Europe has become this dialogue platform in Slovakia, Czech Republic, currently also Budapest and Poland. These capital cities, the para-diplomacy is actually on a rise. When the dialogues are not only in Paris or in Berlin or in London, but they're also in Central Europe. And India has been very good at attending these forums and actually interacting with European Union bureaucracy in this space. So this also elevates role of our small and medium states from this region, because we always had this European divide between the Western Europeans and Eastern Europeans. What I found very interesting is ultimately, how I view it, we really rely on this European factor in Indian foreign policy. If India decides to engage more on high profile, as you mentioned with the visit of the president, of prime minister, then we get something out of it. But if they don't decide to show up, then it's not really on the agenda. And does that really mean if Modi is in Poland, that there are tangible outcomes? Yes, that definitely turned into tangible outcomes, but the Slovak visit was very symbolic. There was definitely not the same translation of a relationship. It could be for many reasons. Slovakia doesn't have the same defense sector right now and the same hype as it would be for Polish people, and also Poland. We mentioned this during the discussion that Polish people are very focused on studying India as a scholars, as think tankers, as academics. There is way more scholarship taking place also about Nepal. There are young people who are given opportunities in Warsaw and other universities from this region, from South Asia, who get to publish and provide these perspectives. And it's very welcome in Poland. So I personally find it very positive and it's helpful to us. So we are in the strategic radar because we do have manufacturing, but we have to bear in mind India is coming to space that's been already taken over by Japanese manufacturing, by Korean companies that have dual manufacturing, let's say in Czech Republic, Slovakia at the same time, by Taiwanese, by Chinese. So it's a space that's already busy. And so you are entering a space that has not had strong bilateral relations. And now the manufacturing is already taking place. So we need to bear that in mind. And of course, these countries, especially now Poland and Czech Republic, with their governments, are very preoccupied with the European security architecture. So their mindsets are on what's happening with Ukraine, how they can help Ukraine, migrants from Ukraine. So they don't have really that global perspective. It's a bit different with Hungary, obviously. Hungary has a very much go east kind of perspective. They don't use the term Indo-Pacific in their narratives too much. They have not embraced it, but they are very open to this multi-vectoral foreign policy, very similar to India. And when I was there this year, the Hungarian think tank, which is connected to the MFA, actually set up Budapest Dialogue. It's the second year now, and they prefer having conversations that are critical also of the West, critical maybe of the European Union sanctions regime. So they have a bit different narrative than the Polish or Czechs. So when I mentioned in my remarks V4, the Visegrad group, that label is not really embraced by absolutely everyone because the MFAs don't really want to have a strong affiliation because it sometimes is counter what they're trying to do in their foreign policy in Europe and in a global sphere. So we have to be very careful. Saying that, some of my colleagues actually wrote a paper. I brought it here to share as a resource from the Central European Institute of Asian Studies, which is based in Slovakia, but they collaborated with colleagues, Jagano Panda, who is in Sweden, as you know, and there's other colleagues from Poland and also Czech Republic, and these are Slovak people. So they collaborated on Visegrad Four and India and kind of searching for the collaborative agenda because they're also frustrated probably that there is a potential, but it has not been fully discovered. And some of the timelines, when I was looking at it, they were tracing times from like 2020 would be kind of a milestone for the Czech MFA minister flying to Raisina dialogue and engaging, and Hungarian one, and having first meetings with Jaishankar and having these initial interactions. And every year now, if you look at the timeline, the Slovaks show up with their Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Polish come, and everybody has their leader idea pod and they share their perspectives in India. So this Raisina dialogue has become a platform for this conversation on a high level meeting. So I would argue that this is one of the formats that work for this interaction. Another one is, of course, ORF helped the Budapest dialogue to set it up. There is a know-how now from New Delhi that works in Tokyo. There is a dialogue in Sydney. There is a dialogue in Africa, Middle East, as you know. Even there was a Bandung conference, as you know, with Indonesia. There's absolutely all these platforms set up. And there's ORF Washington, where is Jaishankar's son, Juva. So everybody from the government is now pushing these dialogue partnerships across the world. Personally, I find it very useful because it's done openly. And like I said, they don't really discriminate who will be invited and from which country. They give a lot of chance to also, obviously, to gender representations. There's a lot of Indian female entrepreneurs that were involved, or African. They're very outspoken group of people, which I found very useful to learn about all these other societal groups that are very involved in different projects. Another very important part of ESC was when I was looking at the economic figures. You rightly pointed out Poland as the front runner. Majority of imports obviously coming is from India. It's disproportionate. It's an uneven trade, more coming from India, less being exported. Second would be Czech Republic, third Slovakia, fourth Hungary. Hungary, on the other hand, is a very good recipient of investments, but we have to bear in mind the electric vehicles now. The manufacturing is all from China, based in Hungary. Hungary is the first country from this region that changed the dynamics of Chinese investment, because at first you would see majority of investment going to the West, Italy, and also France, Spain, UK, Germany, and they complained about the Eastern Europe as taking some Chinese investments and going against the European Union. But when we did assessments, we found out that only about 5% of the Chinese investment actually landed in Eastern Europe. And out of that 5%, only about 5 countries were really benefiting out of the 16 or 17 that were involved in that trade. Today, we can actually say Hungary is actually one of the highest recipients of Chinese investment. It changed the narrative. And also for India, it's one of the positive partners, because they're not so judgmental. And they also have their grievances with Ukrainians because of their minorities. So they also don't want to be on the side of very pro-Ukrainian narrative. So I would say this is very interesting, and it's going to evolve more. When I work in the Czech policy sphere, but also parliament, sometimes obviously I had to write papers and talking points for meetings. I recall I was studying how the Czech ministries were working with the Indian space, because there was a lot of discussion how our businesses can get on the Indian market. Interestingly, Babiš, who is now running for term for the governance, second time a businessman, set up small funding through the Ministry of Industry and Trade to give their small businesses incentives for feasibility studies. And it was actually the Czech businesses themselves who set up some hubs to learn about India, provide desk space in India, and help the network. It was the business that was driving this interaction. And he was highlighting India as one of the top 10 partners, economies that he wants to engage with, saying that he had a bad experience in China. He got his, I think, fingers burned by some business deals. So he refocused maybe, but he's running for elections now. Czechs will have an election. So it's very possible that if he is victorious, there will be even more of this kind of engagement through these hubs already. That's already been set up. And one of the most expensive parts for the business is to really do the feasibility studies and figure out whether it makes sense, right? Small business doesn't have that extra money and support network. Personally, I think it's such a complicated environment in India. Everybody is offering you some opportunities. And Central Europe is so small, population-wise even, that we can't even grasp the size of a population in India. As you know, it's unprecedented. So unless you really go there and experience that scale, you probably have no idea. But I would say that's one of the things that everybody's recommending, to tap into this potential, because it is untapped in many ways. I will not repeat some of the points you mentioned already, but for India, obviously, interest is the tech transfers to EU market. So through different sectors, such as automotive and obviously some digital infrastructure, there is a big desire to create Central Europe as a testing ground or some kind of a launching pad to access the other markets in Europe. Personally, I found it very interesting how India shared, or the representation shared with me, the difficulty to get visas, even for students to study and people to work and engage. It's a very bureaucratic process, and that's probably making it very difficult for India to engage with this region, is the bureaucracy of things. And I think often I met students maybe from India on trains in Europe through these programs that were traveling from Germany to Austria, and they felt very lonely. It's a different space. Culturally, I think that's also a part that in India, people are used to interacting with the family members, cousins, and get things done. You make a phone call and everybody's involved. And these societies can be quite closed off. And so it's very hard. I will fly to Perth right now because I have the same experience when I interact with the Indian community in Western Australia. I just went to the celebration of the National Day of Independence, and I had a meal with the local people, and they shared the same. They felt the people in Western Australia were also more standoffish. They were not reaching out. So I'm trying to make a difference with my students and maybe tap into these communities. But it's very different culturally. And I think that what makes the experience that much harder, I would say. As somebody who's used to a lot of Chinese diaspora in Australia, in Central Europe, you see how this is lagging. And not having that people to people experience, I think, makes a big difference. What some of the local people do, they travel to India, and they, like Americans, they look for this enlightenment, drink water, bath, and yoga. And it's I would say it's ironic, because they don't really understand the culture in the end. They just go to these retreats, and I think they see something that they imagine that they'll find themselves, but they bring the trouble with themselves, so they don't really fix themselves. Yeah, they just have a memory of some bracelets probably and baths, but they misunderstood what the meditation is meant to do. So I think that's what the experience is also for some people from Central Europe on a people level, if I'm supposed to mention this as a point, that I find there's this disconnect with the public opinion, because that's highlighted in some of these studies. That there is a limited awareness and ambivalence, as was pointed out, especially with the young people. And that's a concern for me the most, that the young people would not understand each other more, because we have these Erasmus programs in Europe where students travel to different universities, have exchanges, but this should also be in this context. And a final point, because I don't want to waste too much time on my additional data points, but I wanted to mention another point is personally, as I said, I currently work more with the Australian context. So I've been in touch with the consul who is based in Perth, and just change the public diplomacy, maybe make it more targeted. So we actually have a support from them to reach out to my students, let's say, or I can help these think tankers in Central Europe to have better targeted public diplomacy where we can cross these bridges, because everybody talks about potential, uses these spaces for big discussions, but doesn't really make it sustainable in a way that would be platforms and relationships that we could build on. So as you can see here, I'm here through my Bulgarian contact from Prague, and I was very lucky that the person is based here and reached out. But otherwise, I wouldn't have a platform how to reach out to this group here and interact just on my own. So we always need a link. But I'll stop here because, yeah, I want to make sure we have a conversation, and yeah.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for this presentation. Before opening the floor for some questions, let me just ask you, let's say, two very general questions. One is, you know that there is this kind of acceleration of the FTA negotiations between the European Union and India, especially in the last couple of months. So where do Central European countries stand on this? Are they pushing for this FTA? Is it kind of kind of a focus of their interest. That's my one of my questions. And the other is kind of more about the defense relationship, which has been kind of going on with Poland for a while. So what would you say on these two issues? Oh, Oscar.
Well, the free trade agreement, obviously, that they do through the EU representation. Shevchovich, who is now in charge of this trade and economic side of things in the EU, is a Slovak person. And obviously, they want to see a good outcome. So it's done through these commissioners and representation in the EU. So it wouldn't be done on a bilateral level. During those conversations, it's only mentioned as a point, as a talking point, but they don't negotiate the details, obviously. That's the bilateral relationship. That's where they would be focused on individual exchanges, like so that's a different conversation. But on the EU level, they're very supportive because India is perceived by the elites as positive partner. So they want to see actually good outcome. It's definitely not as conflicted as would be with China or other partners. Even Australia has a very difficult negotiation with the European Union, but I think India in general there's already the positive approach. So they would just embrace what's happening on the EU level, and the specific departments in the ministries would be involved when they submit their points on what's been negotiated. In terms of defense, from what I know, and I know because I dealt with some defense attaches in Czechia, the Indian one at that point was very active, attending the NATO air shows and really involved in these engagements, similar because they always invite global partners. So they would be attached together with South Korea, Japan, Australia, and India would be viewed as a positive partner in defense discussions. Obviously, NATO is not just Air Force, but it's also police, and it's also heavily involved with from firemen through every kind of actor who is involved in national security and defense. What specifically is part of discussions is obviously India's experience with terrorist attacks and how a country deals with a city attack on infrastructure. Specifically, I know Czech politicians would be very interested in those conversations, how India handles such a situation, as there was an experience already. So I was at those discussions. I remember having those conversations. And that obviously is important because Central Europe, luckily, hasn't experienced any of these incidents. And so we consider ourselves lucky, unlike maybe France and UK having first-hand experiences. So in terms of security, so it would be this kind of national security, counterterrorist measures. In terms of defense, obviously you mentioned already some defense agreements, but the question with India, as you pointed out also, is India tends to play with Shanghai Cooperation, but also with the Western forces. So it's confusing. It's actually very confusing for these countries such as Poland and Czech Republic right now what to do, because as you know, Indian Modi was in China right now. The Hungarian and the Slovak PM were there as well. They were participating in the military parade, but the Czech or the Polish were not there. So they were confused about the hype and where India stands. Because as you know, there was a lot of optics of Modi interacting with Putin and Xi, and they find that very confusing. So I wonder how that affects their defense perspectives and threat perception to share technology with countries that are not fully just on one side, that they actually have agreements with everyone. So that would be the kind of thinking that would be taking place in these countries.
I think that this is very important that you mentioned this kind of, how to put it, contradiction in some ways. Especially, I think it's true for Poland because Poland has emerged as the main defense partner of India in Europe and obviously in Eastern Europe, excuse me. And Poland feels obviously very strongly on Ukraine and on Russia. So it's kind of a very complex thing. In this context, by the way, just one more question and I'll open it for open the floor. How do you think the recent kind of crisis in US-India relations will impact the relations between Central European countries and India? Because obviously now we are kind of in a very complex moment in Washington-Delhi relations. So do you think this will have any impact, or is it just kind of something happening over the horizon?
I wonder who doesn't have a crisis with the Washington right now or hasn't experienced some crisis. I would say, and that's my perspective. I remember when we had, and this is a kind of connection that I want to make as a context. When we had the Brexit, there was a very lengthy, obsessive debate how the Europe will recover from Britain leaving European Union because of the work permits and students attached and all this. And there was so much obsession to map the interactions. And we are in a similar position now with Washington because there are pre-existing agreements and suddenly everything is on the table. So I remember when the Brexit happened and we had negotiations and every delegation said, so how do you feel about this? And we said, fine. There is like 27 or 7 of us and we just feel like there's many of us, we have a lot to do. We keep going and they just go somewhere else. They made their choice. So we just moved on. We did not over obsess about this. They don't want to be here. Okay, you go. And the same I feel about Trump and their decisions. It seems to be so unpredictable and kind of emotional that it might change overnight, as you can imagine. But I would say India, because when I was at the Raisina now, Tulsi was there. She was giving speech, Tulsi Gabbard, and so she was highlighting the connections with India, and it was very warm. This is before the fallout, and so there was a lot of good vibe, and suddenly it's not a good vibe. And I think India, because it's so resilient in having these multivectoral exchanges, it will not stop having that because India shares the threat perception with US on China. So I think that's going to drive that relationship further beyond these current trade exchanges. I think the Chinese factor in that relationship will prevail and that will drive it. So I'm not too worried. For Central Europeans, this is a positive move because it can help us to really focus on each other and what we can do together and reinforce that we have this potential here, but we actually can make something decent happen. So I say this to everyone where I go to forums, east coast of Africa to the east. I say to everyone, let's not worry about what's happening over there. Let's focus on what we can do here. And I think that's the best approach.
Thank you. Now, let me open the floor for questions. So please.
Or maybe contribution comments.
Contributions, comments, outpours. Please, Doctor Pushpa.
Thank you for a very good presentation. I have absolutely no idea about Central Europe as such. But when you said that, the space that India perhaps is wanting to go into, particularly in economics side, into manufacturing and stuff, those are some of the areas that's already taken. So India might not find enough space over there. So I was thinking of how is Central Europe doing with clean energy now? And is that a space where perhaps India might find a role over there, or is that space also been taken already?
I have just marked my notes here when you started talking, and it says India's expert in solar batteries and green hydrogen complements the V4 because we are part of the decarbonization. So that's exactly the space. I have not mentioned it, but that was in my notes. because I think we say they could create this sustainable kind of a tech corridor, and green energy corridor. So it is a space that would be very welcome. And I think that's the one where they will work more effectively going forward. Yeah.
Please.
But how would China come in over there? Because I think China is supposed to be more competitive than India. And so if China is already there in other spaces, will it fill this space as well?
No, but you see, this is the thing. China is not in all of these countries welcome. Like Czech Republic just signed a nuclear deal with Korea. They beat French and everyone. Russia was unwelcome. Even Japan was beat in this, and China was not welcome in the energy sector in Czech's context. So India would actually stand a chance as the front runner. So that's not taken for sure. And I would imagine Poland would feel the same way, because they did have an infrastructure project with Poland early on highway, which was meant to be the for China's portfolio with the Belt and Road Initiative going forward. And they canceled it because of concerns over also quality and disagreements over how much local workforce and material will be used. So yeah, they scrapped it, and that was a blemish on a Chinese infrastructure project. Then they went into the joint rail project with Hungary and Serbia. But the problem is that one country is in European Union with specific tender and standard conditions, and the Serbs are not. So there is more flexibility. EU actually stepped in and said, no, we have to have a committee and investigate whether this was open call, fair tender, and they had to renegotiate terms. So I think this is the problem with China, that it can have potential and know-how, but they have a tendency to bypass the standardization and rules on the ground. And I think India would be a better partner in that regard, viewed as more transparent and more, with the European standards. So yes, you can have like you said, you can be, that's your niche, but somebody else comes with better. And all these agreements have a special, I would say, sentence attached that says the country should collaborate also in projects in third-party countries together. So if you are submitting a proposal from India in this space and you say, okay, on this project we will work here, but we are open for Czech companies or Polish companies or Slovak companies to collaborate on another tech project somewhere else together, that gives you upper edge. And China doesn't always want to sign these kind of agreements when they would attach a third, like a foreign country and do, you know what I mean, do collaboration in the third space. And I think India wouldn't hesitate to have that additional. It's kind of condition, but it's also plus for both of you, right? You want to both build your indigenous networks and businesses. So yeah, out of these 4 countries, definitely opportunities for India, because China, what they did, if I'm talking too much, stop me, but China acquired. China acquired in, let's say in Czech Republic, they mainly acquired a beer brewery. I never tried that beer. If it's not Pilsner, I'm not touching it. And they acquired a travel agency and potentially real estate in the city, but they never really at that time converted this to tangible investments that would produce, that was Taiwan actually that set up some chips, and they are offering now chips even in Slovakia, but not mainland China. So those promises that they gave through Xi Jinping's visit in 2016 to the region in Czech, they did not fulfill with major investments. They were kind of to set up some operations, but not really, and proper projects and proper investments. So the name has been somewhat tarnished because a lot of promises and not many tangible outcomes. So I wouldn't be too worried, but you are on the right track suggesting this portfolio. I think that's the way forward. Yeah.
I think it's also very important to mention here that in Central Europe, there are very strong domestic politics of China and Chinese involvement, and India doesn't have the same problem. So, for example, if you look at the Czech Republic, there are very powerful politics of the relationship with China, especially in the last 5, 6, 7 years, and that's true also for Hungary, where there have been quite a few Chinese projects, but they tend to be very closely aligned with the government, and the opposition is fiercely critical of Chinese involvement. India has the enormous advantage of not having any of this political baggage. And the other major consideration that is important to have is obviously the European relationship with China and with India, respectively. So with China, it's very complex. It's systemic rival, but it's partner at the same time. It's a very, very complex relationship, and nobody knows where exactly it's going right now. Now, as you know, the world is very much in a state of flux for reasons which are very well known. And therefore, there is a high degree of uncertainty within Europe where the relationship with China is going. And there are very, very different views on this and a lot of internal debate and even clashes. There is no such thing for India. I think that almost everybody, if not everybody, is on the same page when it comes down to India. And I think that clean energy and a lot of other stuff is very much at the top of the agenda when it comes down to interacting with India. So India has a very big opportunity there, I believe. So, any further question? Dr. Palit, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ivan, and thank you, Dr. Izakova, for that very informative lecture. I want to bring in a somewhat wider point here, and I'm taking off from the last part of your subject, the title of your talk, the Fragmented Geopolitical Order. India and the EU were negotiating with the United States on tariffs and trade from practically around the same time, from the time Trump 2.0 came in. And today, of course, India stands where it is, with Brazil the highest tariff slapped country, 50%. European Union has been able to come to an agreement with the United States. The question that I have is that when we look at the EU agreement with the United States, and I'm not the only one if I can have the liberty of saying so, it appears a huge capitulation as far as the EU is concerned. Giving up on all tariffs while accepting American tariffs of 15%, agreeing to a large number of purchase commitments, energy, chips, other things, and a various number of things. The question that I have is, because this is actually important from an Indian perspective, because India is negotiating with the European Union as well, the free trade agreement, which is, if all goes well, the 13th round is beginning from next Monday, and there are expectations of this being concluded very fast. But the US relationship will remain. Now, the point that I wanted to check from you is, and this is vis-a-vis the US, is it because that the European Union was kind of forced to accept this on account of the US military security guarantee for Ukraine? And if that is the case, does it mean that for a country like India, or maybe similar countries in similar positions, it will necessarily have to be a military security guarantee to come to terms with the United States? Is that where this is going? What's your thought on that?
Well, it's a right thinking, I think, and you're right, because if you see how the European delegation was treated like a group of school children coming to a field trip to Washington after Putin had a red carpet trip with Putin, that really showed them that. And that's one of the fears, that they're negotiating about Ukraine without the powers at the same table under their terms, right? So I think, as you rightly pointed out, and also the threats to NATO. Saying that, as somebody who is originally from NATO country, it is necessary because the countries were lagging behind with the, that reset is not something new. We knew that we had to do this and step up with defense spending. But I would say Trump is in a very good negotiation position there, as you said, with the guarantee. just before these tariffs, actually, quite a few countries, even Czech, signed very good defense deals with US. There was a big competition whether to buy Swedish Gripens or American F-35s. It was playing out in media intensively. The generals were divided half and half almost. It was very passionate. They were long-term relationships were broken because they felt like they didn't want to contribute to American defense, military, da da da. But they won. It was successful. So I think Trump sees this as a space where they can operate. And I think Ukraine, as you pointed out, with it's not just defense, but it's access to minerals, although it's questionable to what extent it's actually there. That's a big question. I don't know what he sees there, but I would say with India, you're right that it will have to be some kind of a guarantee. On the other hand, when I listen to Indian politicians to speak about this openly, I find that they're very adamant to say we are a sovereign country and we will not back down. We will not do something that will go against our, thinking. So I feel like they're very reassured and reinforced. They feel like they're not alone fighting Trump. That there is, and that's why there was such a bromance, I think, also in China to showcase their alternatives. Another one is obviously BRICS and use of national currencies. As you know, that's actually big debate even in Australia, that's coming to a more collaboration. SEO is enlarging. So I personally think that Europe is in a worse position. It definitely doesn't have this, because Europe is very specific who they work with, and India has way more partners and options. So I personally would say it probably will continue being a heated discussion, but ultimately, I somehow feel like India will not just back down. I'm getting the sentiment that they will probably have to make some deals, but it will be more confident approach than from European Brussels. I feel like Brussels is really playing second fiddle here right now. It doesn't matter if 7 or 8 politicians show up. I think it doesn't make such a difference. So, and Europe in general has to fix their image because we failed at preventive diplomacy as a union. One of the key core elements we failed. So we have this full-scale war now that is affecting everyone. So we have a lot of work to do there. So yeah, I think you have way more charismatic and stronger politicians than I don't know how long Macron will be around, but I don't know how much like Trump respects Macron and these politicians, So what are your thoughts? You think there will be like a defense concession?
No, my sense is that
Maybe you should speak in the mic. I'm sorry.
No, firstly, thank you for that very candid explanation. I really appreciate it. On the Indian side, I think the understanding is that there's no Indian government, or for that matter, any Indian prime minister, which can actually accept some kind of a military security guarantee vis-a-vis the United States, because today, whatever that be, it will bring in Pakistan, and no Indian prime minister or government can accept that. It's non-negotiable, number one. The second thing is that I think on the Indian side, there is a realization, and this realization connects to the fact that it could be an increase in India's economic size or strategic influence or say in global affairs. I think India realizes that the era of having friends is over. Given the kind of growth that it has achieved and where it aspires to, it will not have any friends. It might have partners.
Okay.
It might have partners on a transactional basis, on a need basis, because its size has enlarged, its strategic growth has happened. And to that extent, it's kind of one of the major powers among the middle powers, if I can put it that way. And as a result of that, it needs to work with people with that objective at the back of its mind. There's nobody who really it can consider as a wholesome friend. But in that list, I think Russia does figure. The Russia-India relationship has been historically strong and solid. I mean, there are people in India who would argue that Russia has never let India down, whatever be the conditions, the global situation, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a little bit of a debt of gratitude in that regard with respect to Russia, which leads to private conversations between the two prime ministers on occasions. But otherwise, I think India is very much conscious about the fact that it's no more, I mean, with the United States, it can have a strategic relationship, but that does not mean that it's an ally. I think India is very careful in not using that term anywhere, that, because that being an ally has a very different implication. Partner, yes, different matter. India is also a comprehensive strategic partner of the ASEAN, Southeast Asia, and other countries, with Australia, with certain other countries. So I think that realization is there, and there's a certain degree of confidence in that. But there's also this sense that it has to take risks. It has taken a risk. What has happened with the US will have some economic implications. It has to be prepared for that. It might get worse over time, unless other avenues open, unless the global situation changes. So,
But other countries are in the same boat in a way, even though maybe the tariffs are lower, but the sentiment of seeing US as a trusted partner or ally, as you say, is actually over for many. I speak to South Koreans, I speak to Australians, everybody is seeking new partnerships and diversify because they are in a kind of similar boat.
yeah.
I think everybody has been shook. I know countries are very concerned in Southeast Asia with some of the requests to increase their defense budgets beyond like massive increases from small percentage to like 4% suddenly. I've studied a lot of the responses from Southeast Asia in a way that some are celebrating that there were readjustments, but everybody says don't feel comfortable because you actually are still in a bad situation here, and it's not a diplomatic victory. You have to still renegotiate terms, and this is you're still having a shorter part of a rope. So I would say when you, like you said, people share privately more this information rather than publicly. Everybody's a bit anxious to speak up, not to have repercussions. But I think I notice economically speaking and trust in that relationship has been tarnished. And so India is not alone. Maybe I like how you position it that the semantics matter, that it's not ally, it's a partnership. I kind of like that additional assessment. I think it's so important to and hear your perspective because you definitely see deeper than I would ever understand the Indian politics.
I suspect, I mean, my young colleagues and others will have perhaps more to contribute in this regard. But for India, the neighborhood is a huge challenge. And as a result of that, I think increasingly there is this feeling that it can't send a signal that it's more on one side and less on the other. That attitude is probably not going to work. It needs to really measure its steps very carefully. And I think the worry on the Indian side is that this fragmentation in the geopolitical order, increasing use of geoeconomic tools, and whatever else comes with it, is actually going to have a toll on its ability to bring better living conditions for its people. So let's say, for example, with the European Union, if it gets into a free trade agreement, there are certain ideas what that FTA will deliver for India. But if the geopolitical conditions are unfavorable, and for a country like India, maybe because of its geography, it's all the more unfavorable, then the benefits of those agreements are not going to flow. So I think that's India's worry. That's why, I mean, I personally feel that the urge is to diversify and stay as, as effectively connected to various hubs as possible. And that includes working with China.
Yeah.
I think that realization is pretty much there. So I don't know whether anybody else might want to comment in this. You want to comment?
Well, just to make one point on this comparison between Europe and India when it comes down to negotiations with Trump, I think there are some substantial differences. India was becoming dependent on the US, but Europe is already very dependent on the US. So this puts it in a much weaker position. And what was at stake, I believe, was not just US involvement in Ukraine or support for Ukraine, but the whole transatlantic relationship in many ways with NATO and so on. And I think that many people in Europe have difficulty imagining a future without this relationship. They haven't thought through it, maybe with the exception of some people in France, which has a different position on this issue. And then, of course, another major difference is that in Europe, well, there are substantial divisions between different member states when it comes down to dealing with the US. Some want strategic autonomy, others are very kind of supportive of a much closer relationship with the US, especially in Eastern Europe, while India speaks with obviously one voice on this issue. So this is a very, very big difference. And also, I think that Europe has been very heavily invested in its current, politically invested in its current policy when it comes down to Russia, for example, or Ukraine. So to such an extent, kind of the ruling dispensation has been invested in this, that any change in direction would come with very substantial political prices, including domestic political prices, because you have to understand that Europe in many ways faces different challenges. There are external challenges, but there are also internal challenges. And I seriously suspect that a lot of leaders in France, Germany, in Brussels are much more afraid of their domestic developments with coming elections, with the rise of the far right and so on, than external ones. And inevitably, this is related to the relationship with Washington and to the foreign policy course. So I think that the whole setup of the relationship is very different between Europe and India. And I think that this puts Europe in a very different position. But of course, I do agree that leadership is a key role, and that they kind of, well, let's say that they yielded a lot under American pressure, much more than anybody expected. And I think that there will be a price to pay on the long run for this.
I actually found it interesting that this was the first time in the long history of negotiations between Europe and India. For the first time this year in February, the European Commissioner visited India. And there was a very clear emphasis on the fact that this trade agreement has to be concluded during the course of the year. And it came just about 2 weeks or 3 weeks after India and US had their negotiations on agreeing on a trade agreement. So I think there was this understanding on both sides that whatever happens with the White House is different, but we need to get our act together. So in one sense, one can say it was farsightedness. And I think the kind of reporting, at least that is coming out in the Indian media on the EU FTA is actually quite positive, because the impression that is coming out is that there is fast track negotiations. I think around 14 chapters have been completed. The remaining are expected to be completed in September. And whatever, I mean, this is very important, whatever is incomplete is assumably incomplete because the negotiators couldn't agree on those. Now, they will be sent up to the political level for clearance, which I think is the way it happened between India and UK, at that level. So if this is the urgency that has been picked up between India and EU, it's a good sign. It shows that they are both willing to work together, appreciative of the conditions and the context. So
this is exactly what I was trying to say, that I feel like they should seize this moment to accelerate partnerships, not talk about potential anymore. And like you say, there always will be some bits and pieces that might not be a win-win for everyone, but this is not the time to needle pick and overanalyze. And also the moment you mentioned, because I do read the comments of Indian bloggers, like you said, they really like Russia and support Russia. There is quite unprecedented sentiment that I don't see in many places. And we will have to start negotiating European security architecture. And the Slovaks are already on a page. They work with Putin. They want to fix it. So out of this group, probably Slovakia actually will be the one reaching out to Indian partners to work with Russia on some kind of a future for Ukraine and figuring everything out. The voices that are in Europe still don't want to hear this, but pragmatically speaking, this might accelerate as well because it's affecting the food security, obviously, cycle. I would say people here probably are mostly concerned about that part, the food security and that chain, but not maybe other aspects. But also for us, it's the energy flows and that part. So yeah, I would imagine India will play part in these conversations. And as Raisina was, that's become the platform where all of them come to Delhi every year. And Russians are always there, highly represented, and they will have to have these conversations. Maybe India will probably facilitate these closed door discussions. And that's something that I don't think Trump will do. He wants to have the one-on-one, and he won't allow for a roundtable conversation.
Yeah, about the FTA, it's also very important to realize that finally there is political will for it, because the big problem was not so much the technicalities, which are serious, but not the fundamental obstacle, but the lack of political will. And that's why I think that the negotiations got broken, I think circa 2013 or 14, roughly, because there was obviously a change of government in India, but the European Union was in a very big financial crisis, as we all remember, the Eurozone crisis. So there was not enough political momentum behind this FTA. I think that finally there is such a momentum, and that's why I'm cautiously optimistic. I think that it will go forward. But any other questions, please? Oh, there are 2 questions, please.
Maybe collect.
Yes, I'll collect them probably.
Thank you, Dr. Kisakova. I think your presentation was really interesting. My question was about a point that you mentioned on tech transfer and how India can potentially use this Central European countries as a launchpad for the rest of the European market. From my understanding, in critical technologies, there are several regulatory and ethical considerations that are very different between India and Europe. And I suppose that the Central Europe also abide by the same sort of measures. In that sense, how would you say that the technology cooperation can be advanced between these 2 countries, and whether there can be any other format established? Like, I know that there is the India Central European Business Forum, but can there be something similar for tech? Thank you.
Yeah, please, and your question. So sorry about this. I think that they'll hand you the microphone.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Kesakova. My name is Divya. I'm a research associate here. I have 2 questions. One is generally to sort of understand what is India's visibility in Central Europe in terms of how frequently does the country and its relevance get discussed in, say, your popular media, or how aware are people about India? And the second is, we spoke about, or we discussed where India potentially could have opportunities with the Central European countries. If I could flip the coin and ask, where exactly are Central Europe's interest in India? Yeah, thanks.
Not easy questions. I personally think the business forum you mentioned, it will be the business that will drive the discussion on how to collaborate. So that platform being set up is what is going to be used for the semantics. These countries are part of the EU, so they will have to comply, as you know, from that perspective with what's in place. So it's not in the hands of the national governments to accept somebody or some measures without compliance with the EU. I would imagine they will have to find a ways how, and sometimes what happens is these companies have joined shares, and then they will figure out who will, like with Chinese investments, they were not able to have over 50% share in European companies. I would imagine this might be similar if they wanted to have some joint collaboration. It might be the European partner driving the technicalities to make it happen. And we have a lot of startups as well. There's quite a enthusiastic space. But we have to also bear in mind, like Central Europe specifically is a complicated environment for some startups. I've watched quite a few segments recently from the Czech side as well. There are companies who are relocating to other places because they're frustrated with their domestic environment and the government and regulations and bureaucracy. And e-governance is lagging still. I used to work for government for e-governance in 2004-5, which is a long time now. And I was a national rep to go to EU program EWC, which was interoperability of pan-European e-government services for governments, citizens, and businesses. Ridiculous title, which I still remember because it was the biggest nightmare to always explain it to people. But we have not moved from that first part, e-governance. We even in taxation, when you have 4 stages, like I'm in Australia, which is more advanced in taxation than many European countries in eastern part, you should get your refunds to your bank account, all these transactions done electronically. This is still not possible. The Czechs even had a political party called Pirates, which actually wasn't
Pirates,
was not pirates. It was
foreign minister was from there. I'm sorry.
Yeah. But this is the thing. This was a party of guys, IT guys, to bring all these technologies and make changes, and they never succeeded. You know, it's still an issue, and they got voted out. The Minister of Foreign Affairs is from that party, but he's like a lone wolf. They kept him so they don't disrupt. So as much as it sounds like a potential for collaboration, we need to bear in mind these environments are not fully ready to even function on their own and have that advancements. I would say probably Indian IT will outshine them in many ways. So you would be probably laughing at some of the processes and things. So from my friends who work for especially like American companies, Dell computer company has headquarters in Slovakia. My friends work there. So they deal a lot with Indian partners and Indian, obviously, branches. So these, I would say, computer companies, they work quite well. That's all set up, but maybe some other technologies are not fully, and that they are mostly multinationals who are based as headquarters in these countries, and they have the kind of operation set up based on their systems. So, so unfortunately, my obsessively long title of that program, which I don't think even probably works in EU anymore, I don't think it's been fully resolved. So EU sounds advanced, but we all know the jokes when you have the images, like how far is some countries' technology, robots and artificial intelligence, and Europe is figuring out whether we should have one cable for all phones. So that's where we are in terms of our advancements. Is that accurate or?
My experience is yes, although it depends very much on the country in Europe. So, for example, if you look at the Baltics, Estonia, for example, I think that they're way ahead in this respect. Surprisingly, my home country, Bulgaria, seems to be moving ahead in this respect, despite fabulous Bulgarian bureaucracy. We don't have pirates in our
Estonia is excellent example. Yeah, they are considered as a way more advanced. That's true. And you had also questions. They were related to the people's perspective on India. As I said before, I think the public opinion, there it's actually not much information. Usually it would be about yoga. Practice of yoga is very popular, or Indian cuisine. Those are probably the main soft power aspects from what I recall. If you mean like general public, this is probably what they would be focusing on. Not much, even Bollywood is probably understudied. People are, from what I picked up in these places, very focused probably on K-pop or manga, but Bollywood be probably secondary. I would have to search for it myself if I wanted to be in these countries exposed to Indian culture. And yeah, I think it's really the yoga. And like I said, people don't even understanding meditation and this practice is much. There's a lot of work that has to be done. So yeah, if you gave me a questionnaire as part of a project, I would give this very low ranking, unfortunately. It's a part that needs more work. But it's not unique to India. I think in general, anything in Asia is a problem. Even China or Korea gets to reduce to North Korean issues, what Kim Jong-un does and missile, but not much understanding of the culture. Whatever the media serves as a bombastic information that will be highlighted. So if India had some border dispute conflict, that would probably take a spotlight, and that's what people would remember, but not understand like culture or other aspects. I mean, I have to say, what was confusing for a while was for the government started using the term Bharat. It was like, why, and of course, Jai Shankar published the book, Why Does Bharat Matter? And then the political parties uniting under the Bharat title. Like that became the whole interview for me from the Czech side. Can we talk to you about this? What does this mean? Like, what's going on? Why are they using this term? So I had to really like explain it. That was something that confused the Czech media journalists, because suddenly they had to write articles and they didn't understand the context at all. Nobody gave any explanation. They're like, is India going to be renamed now? So, yeah.
My experience is that I very much agree that there is very low cultural visibility of India, but I think it's improving actually a little bit, although from a very low basis, especially with younger generation, to some extent because of greater Indian tourism, to some extent because of some exposure to Bollywood. But I do agree it's very limited, and it's kind of primarily, I mean, passes through a lot of stereotypes, I'm afraid, in some cases. But at the very least, it's improving. So this gives kind of some hope for the future. I think when it comes down to politics, it is sometimes viewed a little bit as some type of counter point to China. And I don't think that people really think of it as a counterweight to China, but usually they think of the East. And in the East, what do you have? You have Japan, you have China, you have India. And kind of just as China has been rising spectacularly over the last several decades, there is a sense that India is also rising and it's an important potential partner. But how does this get expressed in actual initiatives, actual understanding of India? I think that this is still very vague. But there is this idea that India matters more, which I think is in some ways the seed of something bigger on the longer run. But of course, like any seed, you need to water it, and it needs the right conditions to grow into a plant and hopefully a tree and give fruit on the longer run. Now, I'm afraid that our seminar is drawing to its close. So thank you so much for your participation. Thank you very much to Dr. Kizekova for her presentation.